Well, welcome everyone to this month's edition of the FSGC Real World Parenting Series. I am Pam Evans. I'm the Director of Marketing and Development at Family Service and Guidance Center. As you may know, FSGC specializes in helping kids who are struggling with mental health challenges. Could be anything from anxiety, depression, ADHD. And tonight we are here for you. We know parenting, especially these days, is no cakewalk. And, we just are very pleased to be able to be here and answer your questions. As you all know, this month, it is, or you may know, it's National Suicide Prevention Month. So the topic is very fitting. Again, we really appreciate you taking time out of your busy day. I just have a couple of housekeeping things. If you need a certificate of attendance, please just put your first and last name in the chat, and we will gladly get that emailed to you either tomorrow or early next week. So we're happy to do that. And please note, we are recording this session so we can make it available to the community for those who may have wanted to tune in but weren't able to participate for whatever reason. So I'm really pleased this evening to introduce you to our Director of Crisis and Recovery Services. Travis Freed is going to be answering your questions this evening. So Travis, I'm just going to ask you to just do a brief self-introduction and then take it away. Head right in.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for joining, everybody. I'm very open with things. If you have questions or want to add on, you put them in the chat. Pam will help me look for those, and you can just unmute and ask questions as we go along. You're not going to distract me. I've worked in crisis for the last 7 years of my career here at Family Service and Guidance Center. And what we do is we work on our toes. We're constantly running, we're constantly doing things. So I like this kind of free, open, kind of ask, question, answer concept. It works really well for me. So if you have questions, you interrupt me, don't feel like you're going to, it's perfectly fine. Raise your hand, turn your camera off, unmute yourself, go ahead and ask. I have no problems with that. I've been at Family Service and Guidance Center for almost 17 years now. It's been about a month away from 17 years, I believe. So I've worked in the crisis department for 7, and I've had various other positions in the agency in my time here. I love what I do. I do it for a reason, and having conversations like this is a big part of why we do what we do here. Love it. We got a wonderful crisis team here. We're always looking to make improvements. So excited to hear from your guys' experience, and we'll jump in. I'll probably go ahead and just start with questions that were sent to us. But again, if you guys have questions that aren't addressed, or you have more questions about these questions, just ask. I will say there is a general theme on these questions about how do I start having this conversation with my children? So I'm going to answer that question multiple times. I'm going to try and be as consistent as I can. I'm probably just going to go ahead and start with that because it was a question asked multiple times. I'm going to go through and look at the other questions that were all asked as well. I'm kind of looking at them for the first time tonight. Again, I just like to be able to answer questions on the run and answer things on the fly. So one of the most common questions was, how do I start having this conversation, or when do I start having this conversation with my children? When I saw that, I started thinking about it, and I kind of compare it to just about any other conversation you'd have with your child. When I was in school, I started hearing things about suicide in 3rd or 4th grade, and that was several years ago. Today, we have 2nd graders coming to us with things they're hearing in school about suicide, about a peer saying they're suicidal. Well, they may not grasp the concept. It's probably even scarier if they don't grasp that concept. There's not a magic age to start having that conversation, but it's the same thing. It's equivalent. We want to make it equivalent to something like social skills, right? When you want to start talking to your kids about sex, when you want to start talking to your kids about interacting appropriately with teachers, when you want to talk to your kids about anxiety, about depression, about how to act at the table, things like that. We want it to be taboo, not to be taboo. Whoops. We want it to be normalized. We want to make this a common conversation with our children so it's comfortable early and often if we have to. It's not something you have to sit down and say, hey, it's suicide night. We're going to talk about suicide. That's hard. That's a difficult conversation to have. The biggest fear people have about having this conversation is that they're going to put it into their kids' heads. I want you all to understand it's going to be put in your kid's head at some point. If they're going to school, they're going to hear it from a peer. They're going to hear about it from the school. They're going to hear about it from a friend, from somebody. And it's much better they get the information from a parent and someone who can control that than it is from a peer. If I think of a more common topic, and I know I don't try to be graphic, but a more common topic like sex, I want my children to know about sex from my wife and I, rather than from their friends at school, because we all know how that will go. I know what friends taught me when I was in school versus what parents taught me. And it's two completely different experiences that you'll get. So we want you guys to jump in and have that conversation early. If you haven't had that conversation yet, it's okay. Start having the conversation now. So I'm going to jump into the questions now. The first question that we had written in was, how do I explain to my daughter that I experienced the loss of my best friend from suicide, or as I say, taking his life, when she asks how I found out? I know she'll ask, how do I tell her that I'm the one that found him? Really difficult question, right? I think this kind of depends on your kid. Again, we want to be open, we want to be direct, we want to be honest. If you're having this conversation for the sake of teaching your kid about suicide and things you know about suicide, that's great. You want to be cautious though. If you're having this conversation for the sake of trying to heal yourself, you probably don't want to have that conversation with your child. If you haven't effectively coped with it, if you haven't effectively dealt with it and it becomes too emotional for you, it might be better for you to talk with grandparents, another parent, someone else in the family, or get treatment yourself before you start having that conversation with your child. That's one thing we see sometimes, that parents will kind of spill that onto a child, and the child doesn't know how to handle that because they feel like they have to take care of their parents' emotions too. So we want to be very, very careful with that situation. Again, we will help you with that. Call into crisis if you need some help. Call into Family Service and Guidance Center. We'll help you with that. Another question that came in was, my child's 7 years old and is always telling his other mother he wishes he was dead, or that he should kill him. He should kill himself, sorry. Normally it is when he's upset and they are arguing. Not sure if something I should be worried about or how I should talk to him about it. Again, this is why I started with that first question. We want this to be a common conversation. We want it to be an open discussion. So when that does come up, we can sit down and talk about it. We can talk about the impact it has when we're making false accusations of wanting to hurt ourselves or wanting to kill ourselves, and what the consequences of that are too. It's a difficult conversation to have. We always want to take it seriously. People always talk about that, is, how do I know if my child is telling the truth? How do I know if my kid is being honest? You may not. We don't either. We've done this field for years. We work with this stuff all day in crisis, and we don't always know. Sometimes we do. Sometimes we have a good inkling, but you always want to be safe rather than sorry. You're not going to cause more behaviors to do it. There's some pretty clear signs of when someone's manipulating it, in that they may be like, well, if you don't give me my Nintendo Switch, I'm going to go cut myself. There's a bit of a line there. Now, granted, we still want to address that, right? We want to address that as, hold on, that's not appropriate behavior, just like you would with anything else, like a kid throwing a tantrum. It's a little bit different level. And as a parent, that can cause us all sorts of anxiety, not knowing what to do and how to handle that situation. If you're getting stuck in that situation, call. Ask for assistance, call the school for help, call into crisis, call into family service, get an admission. If you have a therapist already, talk to them about how to process that with your kid, so you're not the only one doing it by yourself. Get someone else in your family that can help you as well. If your student had a classmate who completed suicide, what advice would you give in helping this child in class not feel guilt for not listening better? The question goes on for a little bit more personal information, so I won't share that much. But how do you handle that situation when your child has actually experienced a classmate who has experienced death? I'm going to go back to the importance of having this conversation frequent and often. Now, if this has already happened, it's okay. Sit down and have a conversation. How would you handle the conversation of your child's grandmother passing away, or your child's grandfather passing away, or father, or sibling, or whoever it may be, or best friend, whether it was from suicide or not? We want to sit down and have an open conversation. The best thing we can do is sit back and listen. This is what we do a lot in therapy. We sit back, we listen, we see where the kid is, and then we start putting our interjections in. We don't want to put too much of our own opinion in. We definitely don't want to say things like, I understand. While you may have an experience similar, we all experience things differently from an emotional standpoint. And saying I understand can really put up walls and shut someone off. We want to be very careful saying things like that. I think it's really important to again, I say it many times, but be direct about it. Have that conversation. It's something that can take people a very long time to get over. It's something that you may always deal with and you may always be coping with. But having someone for your child to know they can go to have that conversation when they're feeling that way is so critically important, whether it's a teacher, a friend, a parent, a therapist. That's what we're really looking for. We want those people in place, those safety nets in place for your child. And again, if we start talking about this early, direct, and often, you're going to have much more success with your child come to you with those situations.
Hey, Travis,
Yes.
can we go back to the one question, the parent who had a 7-year-old and, trying to figure out if they really mean it or not. Do you have any recommendations on, specific language or questions to ask them or, because I do remember when my son was about that age, when he got really ramped up, he figured out that would trip our triggers.
Absolutely.
So do you have any, yeah.
It's funny you bring that one up because I was looking back at some notes I took and I was like, whoops. Skipped a part of that one. Okay. And then what I wrote was scaling questions, right? And scaling questions are a therapy tool we use. They're super simple to use. What we do is we typically ask 1 to 10, where are you at today on whatever the scale is? In this case, be suicide. So let's say I'm talking to Johnny and I say, hey, Johnny, 1 to 10, where are you at today? 10 being like, we're ready to do it today. 1 being like, really not an issue, Travis, we're going to move on. And Johnny tells me a 6. Right? I'm going to ask some follow-up questions. I'm going to ask Johnny, what's it going to be for you to take? What's it going to take for you to get to be a 7? And then what's it going to take for you to get to be a 5? Right? I want to know what's going to make it better. I want to know what's going to make it worse. But we also want to ask questions about what Johnny's looking forward to on the weekend. Right? So if Johnny's saying, I'm going to kill myself if you don't give me my Nintendo right now, or they're ramped up and they're just upset with you. So look, I'm going to go kill myself, Mom, Dad, I'm going to go kill myself, whatever the case may be. We want to obviously take it seriously, but we want to think about the context of the situation. If it's happening every time they're upset, we want to be cautious. Yes, it could be manipulative, but we also want to be cautious that it's not. Are there other signs going on? Do they have a history of harming themselves? Do they have other thoughts going on? So ask specific questions. How are you going to do this? How are you going to hurt yourself? How are you going to kill yourself? That's such a difficult question as a parent to ask. Yeah. When I ask that question in session with people feeling this way in my office, I get a lot of looks from parents. They're like, what are you doing? And then the kid, the vast majority of the time, says, I don't know. I don't have a means. I've heard means from duct taping myself to a wall and shoving a beehive in my mouth in the middle of winter to using a gun, right? There's obviously different methods there. One I'm much more concerned about. The other one really isn't feasible. So that way we can gauge how much they've thought through it. We can gauge where they're at with it. The more lethal the means, the more detailed the means, the more concerned we are absolutely going to be. If a child starts telling me, yeah, I'm going to cut my arms with a paperclip, I'm concerned, but I'm not as concerned as a child who says, I'm going to cut my arms vertically with a butcher knife and lay in a bathtub to prevent clotting because I've done my research, right? Huge difference between those two. Now, am I concerned about self-harming behaviors with someone cutting with a paperclip? Absolutely. We can make mistakes and it can be very dangerous, but my concern level drops drastically from the other one, from the other option. Pam, does that help answer your question some?
Yeah. And so I guess my follow-up question for that, and because I know this is a common one, you alluded to the being careful about saying, I understand. Mm-hmm. Are there other phrases, words, sentences that you use to kind of get more at the heart of the behavior or what they're saying?
Yeah, so I think what most of us really in that situation want to hear, I'll do it in supervision with clinicians. I reflect back what they're saying to me, right? They're going to say, hey, I'm feeling suicidal. And we're starting to ask questions. Why? What's going on? I'm being bullied at school, or mom said this, or dad said this, or my relationship with my brother and sister isn't going well. I'm going to say something along the lines of, wow, that sounds really difficult. What that does is it lets the child know you're listening to them, and they're going to open up and give you more feedback. They're like, yeah, you're right. This is really difficult. You get it. You understand what I'm talking about. Trust me, try this with your spouse, try this in a relationship. It's an amazing thing what happens. You just reflect it back to them. My wife has worked in this field too. She knows it, but she doesn't catch it until afterward. Sorry, Trista, if you're watching, but she absolutely knows this, but at the same time, she'll do it back to me. People do it back to me, and it's very helpful for me to be like, yeah, you get it. My supervisor does it to me here. Yep, I know what you're doing because I've done this for the last 17 years of my life, but it's still helpful because it makes you feel heard. That's really a lot of what therapy is about. That's what having a conversation is about. We don't want to talk to death about it. We don't want to talk them into the ground to where they're bored. How many times were all of you at some point getting lectured by your parents or grandparents, or whoever it was, and sat there, and for the first 2 minutes, you're like, yep, I get it. And then 15 minutes later, mom and dad are still hollering at you, and it goes in one ear and right out the other, right? I can attest that has happened many times with my parents. And it's happened many times that I've seen with parents in my office or clients in my office, et cetera. I'm guilty of it. 17 years of doing therapy, I'm guilty of doing it. I catch myself and I take a step back and I go back to that, asking that question, or just saying, hey, so that's got to be really tough to feel that way, right? So we want to ask questions about reasons for living, right? What would keep you alive? Like, what stopped you from doing it? How long have you thought about harming yourself or killing yourself, right? We want to know those specifics, because if your child has just started thinking about it, probably a better sign. If your child's been thinking about it for several months, we got a whole other situation in our hands. Our alarm bells are ringing a little bit higher. Yeah, I've been thinking about it for several months. I haven't talked about it. I often talk to families about the difference between someone who's self-harming, who wears long sleeves, versus someone who wears short sleeves, right? That the person who's wearing long sleeves and hiding those cuts is a whole different story than someone who's wearing the short sleeves. Self-harming is a coping skill. It's well known as a coping skill. It's a very dangerous and not a good coping skill, but it works. It's not efficient. It helps short term, but long term, what happens? You have to cut more. You have to cut deeper. It becomes almost an addiction, and we want to stop that behavior, obviously. But if you're seeing your child wearing longer sleeves in the summer or something that's unusual, be cautious. Take a look. It's okay to check those things out. You're the parent. You're in charge. Ask those questions. But yeah, I could go
Thank
list
you.
on days for questions that you
Yeah,
can
I
ask.
know.
The next question was, what signs do you look for in a child that already doesn't want to talk about what's going on with school or friends? Again, a great question. So some of the big things we see, the biggest sign of a child, or really anybody, being suicidal is what we call hopelessness. They don't see any hope in the future. They're not looking forward to what's going to happen in the future. They're not looking forward to college, to graduating high school, to graduating middle school, to the weekend even. The shorter sighted they are, the more concerned they are. When you get in a session with a clinician who's assessing suicidality, you're going to hear a lot of what we call future seeking questions. Well, what are your plans this weekend? Right? What are you doing with your friends this weekend? You're going to see a lot of really interesting responses. And just last night, I was on call last night. I had a kid come in and he was struggling, and he had no plans. He just wanted to go home and he wanted to kill himself. Obviously, we're going to take that very seriously. He had no plans for graduation. He had no plans. And I've worked with this kid before in the past, very happy, very bubbly kid. Today, no eye contact, really down, hiding his face from me, in tears. He'd been giving belongings away. We want to be cautious about those kind of things. You want to talk about that and be open about it. I'm going to point that out. I've noticed a difference in your behavior. I've noticed it changed, and I'm really worried about you. Can you tell me more about what's going on? And a lot of times the kid will start talking to me. We got the kid the help he needed, and he's doing very well right now. So we want to make sure we address those things. Other signs you can look for are maybe giving away personal belongings. That's something you'll see in kids a lot of times. More depression, abrupt changes in mood. It's not just depression. A lot of times, if you have lived with someone who's depressed, sometimes you'll see this abrupt change in their mood. They'll go from depression to almost this kind of like excited and can't calm down. And it might feel really good. You're like, hey, they feel really good today. From our perspective in the mental health field, that can be a big warning sign in that they've accepted they're going to kill themselves, especially if they've already been talking about it. So if you have a youth that's already kind of talked about it or you're concerned about it and their mood just changes like that all of a sudden, not just in a given day, but over a couple of days maybe, you want to be having an open conversation about this. It's a really a kind of a big warning sign. I know it sounds weird, but if you're living with someone who's been depressed and just moping around and really having a difficult time for months or years even, and then all of a sudden we see a switch in behavior, we should be asking questions. Just like anything medically, right? You see a big change in your arm use, you can't move your arm over your head anymore, you probably go to the doctor, get it checked out. We want to know when that's happening. So talk to your therapist, talk to your school. I always encourage parents to talk to school when they're seeing things like that. Hey, what are you seeing at school? Are you seeing the same types of behaviors? Maybe it's just happening at home. Maybe it's different at school. Maybe going to school is a big uplifting thing and they like being around their friends. Maybe being at home is a difficult thing for whatever reason because they're not around friends and they're thinking about maybe some of the bad things that happened at school or practice or whatever happened. The next question, how do we know when they are just seeking attention and when they are truly considerate? What signs do I watch for? I move these back to back because it's very similar questions. I think I've kind of addressed this already. So again, what signs do you watch for? This is tricky. And this is a very difficult question to answer without knowing the child. And so I don't want to generally answer this question. If someone's talking about suicide, you want to address it seriously. Without knowing each one of your individual children, without knowing each individual situation, it's very difficult. So in crisis, when we have a kid come in that we don't know, we take things much more cautiously than a kid we do know because we don't have rapport with this kid coming in. We don't have any history. We're getting all this information in a short amount of time, and we're going to approach it a lot differently than a kid we've known for a long time. If this is your child's first time saying these things, whole different situation. You guys are absolutely the experts on your children. Be open about that. If you think it's a concern, talk about it with a therapist. Talk about it with whoever you're close with. Have that conversation. Talk about it to your child. It's okay to say, hey, sometimes do you ever do this because you just need attention? And if you do, what other ways can I help you get attention? Right? Talk about it and what are appropriate ways to seek attention? Just like we would when a kid is dancing on the dinner table. I don't know. We would redirect that behavior. We want to find a better way to express themselves. So what else can we do? Distraction is one of the best things we can do. If your kid is really feeling down and really feeling that way, find something to do with them. Take them for a walk. Go for a bike ride. Go fishing. Go find things they like to do. What are your child's strengths? If it's playing a video game, you may not be a video game person. Your child may be, but just sitting down and watching them play and talking about it, you can see a drastic change in their mood very quickly. And they will start to open up to you about what's going on much more than they would if you're just sitting down and have a conversation like we are during this. In our crisis program, we encourage our staff and train our staff to take kids out and be active with them. Because if you're just sitting one-on-one with a staff member for 8-hour shifts or 4-hour shifts, or even an hour sometimes in therapy, it's very difficult. A lot of our crisis clinicians, if you walk around a crisis building, there's always kids outside. There's always kids walking with a clinician. There's always kids walking, and it can be winter. We're bundling up, we're walking. We've got a ping pong table, we've got a foosball table. We're taking them to do those kinds of things because we know it activates the brain differently. It kind of lowers their guard, and they're more willing to have a conversation with us. So find things they like to do, distract them, and kind of lull them into that sense of, okay, I'm ready to have this conversation now. And if they're still not having the conversation, you can start dropping in the conversation a little bit more, right? I've noticed a change in your behavior. Notice a change in your mood. I'm kind of worried about you. Can we talk about that a little bit? You don't have to stop the game to do it. You can keep playing or whatever you're doing. The next question, how young is too young to talk about your child, to talk to your child about suicide? I addressed this early on, but for those of you who may have attended later, we want to talk about it early. We see kids as early as 2nd grade, 3rd grade coming in, talking about their friend, talking about suicide. them talking about suicide. Again, do you want your child learning about suicide and death from their peers at school or from you? And I think it's very clear, I hope it's very clear, that we want parents to be in charge of that. Again, I go back to equating this to that conversation about sex. Do you want your children to learn that about sex in sex ed in 7th or 8th grade when they already have a very loose idea of what sex is from their peers? Or do you want to have that conversation with them early about what the appropriate boundaries are and how to handle that conversation? Because I all but guarantee you, your kids are talking about it at school, or someone's talking about it at school. They want to have those conversations early. Same with suicide. While it may not be as prevalent as a conversation as something like sex, we want to have that conversation early. We want to have that conversation often. I'm not having this conversation with my 4-year-old child. There's a limit, but you'll know, right? You'll have an idea. My 8-year-old child, we've had a conversation about it. My 11-year-old child, we've had a conversation about it. We don't sit and talk about it every day. We don't sit and talk about it monthly. We've had a conversation early about it. They know what I do for a living, and it's not uncommon that we will talk about it. They'll have questions. Yeah, sure. Come ask questions. Let's talk about your questions. What questions do you have? It's not something you'd have to have like a scheduled time to talk about. That'd be kind of silly to have a scheduled time to sit and talk about suicide, but it comes up in general conversation. If you let it, right? I'm okay with having time to set aside at the dinner table to sit down. You'll be amazed what happens when you're doing those things. Or even if your kid's not feeling down, you're just playing a game with them or doing something they enjoy or just going for a walk, the conversations you can have about your child's day change exponentially, right? A lot of times we ask our children, how's your day at school? In the middle of the dinner table, while the TV is on, while we have our phones in front of us. I'm guilty of that too. And the conversation doesn't go anywhere. Well, we turn all the electronics off and we sit there like, hey, how was your day at school today, Pam? And Pam can have a completely different conversation because there's nothing else to distract her. Next question. What are some things not to say? So tying us back into what was really the first question of the night, don't share too much personal experience. You want your child to experience this on their own and express their emotions on their own. I guess more what I'm trying to get to. If you've experienced the loss of someone through suicide, that's incredibly difficult and incredibly challenging. This goes back to that, don't say, I understand. If you have ever experienced someone coming up to you after the loss of somebody or a traumatic experience, and they come up to you and say, hey, I understand. Some people take that very well, but the vast majority of people are kind of like, no, you don't, you weren't there. You can't experience, even though you're raising your children, you may have 2 or 3 children, they're all going to experience the same event very differently. And I can attest to that, having 3 kids of my own. They all experience the same event very differently. When my grandfather passed away, my 11-year-old daughter struggled with it seriously. My 8-year-old daughter, she struggled with it. She struggles with it now more probably because she understands it more. My son, he was an infant. He had no idea what was going on, right? So when we talk about grandpa and that kind of stuff, it doesn't bother him. My 8-year-old gets tearful. My 11-year-old ends up in my lap and we're snuggling. It's a whole different experience for all of it. It's age. It's different emotional temperament. If I have to compare my children, my 11-year-old is much more just in general empathetic. She's much more emotional. My 8-year-old is my sassy one, and my 4-year-old is just a tornado at all times because he's 4. But knowing that and knowing when the events happened, it's going to affect them differently. 9/11 anniversary just came through. Horrible event that all of us here remember. And we had staff here asking, hey, should we do something about it? And I was like, well, I mean, we have staff here that weren't even alive when this happened. We have staff here that don't recall this event because they were too young. And so it affects us all very differently. Even though I'm 37 years old, someone else here may be 37, we could have experienced it very differently too, because of our upbringing, because of our emotional fortitude, because of whatever else. So keep that in mind. Don't say the dangerous words of I understand, because that's a really good way for someone to put up shields, block you out and end the conversation. Instead, you want to hear back to say, tell me more. That sounds difficult. You sound like you're sad about that. Let's talk about this some more. And again, if you're sharing a personal experience about it, number one, make sure you're ready to share that personal experience and not become too emotionally involved And number two, make sure you're not using your child as your therapist to have that conversation. I see that way too often and way too many times. And it's a difficult thing not to do. I've probably been guilty of it at some point too in my life with my children. And it's something that's, it's dangerous in the sense that if you can't handle it, your child's going to look at you as being someone they can't go to have that conversation. What are some ways to lift up positivity so the child is not so negative all the time? Boy, oh boy, right? I think we've all experienced this with our children. We want to be as strengths-based as we can, right? We just in general as humans are negative in our approach. I talk about this with staff all the time. I talk about this with clinicians all the time. I talk about this with other members colleagues that I work with all the time. We have a tendency to look at what's not going well, and instead of looking at what is going well. I used to do couples therapy when I first got out of school, and it was fascinating because you would always hear what wasn't going well. And you sit down with them and you say, yeah, but what is, right? Well, when I get home, the house is a mess and my husband's home all day, but he's not cleaning. I don't know what he's doing. Yeah, but what is going well? When I get home, he's there for me. He talks to me. He'll help me clean afterward, blah, 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 blah. You'll start hearing those things and listing things that are pros versus cons. It's okay to do that with your children too, right? There's times when we're like, oh my gosh, my children are driving me crazy. In my house, it's every night at bedtime. It's a hostage negotiation to get my children to go to bed sometimes and to stay in their rooms. As I'm sure many of you have experienced, I will give you a helicopter and $1 million to stay in your room if you just stay in your room. Obviously, I can't afford that, but there's times when I want to say that. But I have to go back and think the rest of the day was great. And last night was a really good night. When we're working in our crisis program, we may have a day that was really difficult. We may have had escalated kids. We may have had suicidal kids. And we sit down, but we also think about the successes of that day. Who do we get the help they needed? What client was successful today? What client came out of our program with a new tool set and is doing well and been successful? So it's really looking for the positives. If your child's being so negative, spin it back on them. Yeah, but what went well today? What was successful? What did you have success in? And some kids will come back at you and say absolutely nothing. And you're going to have to dig to find those things, right? But you came home from school, you're having a conversation with me right now, right? You gave me a hug today. That was great for me. I hope it was good for you. I just love getting hugs from my children, right? It feels good, right? You did your chores. I didn't get a call from the school today. Like, we can always find something that went positive. You shouldn't have to look that hard to find something that goes positive. There might be those days that we've all had where it's really hard for us because we're not in that spot either. Use someone else too. If you need help, ask for it. If you're burnt out, ask for help yourself. We do that with our crisis clinicians. Sometimes our crisis clinicians will have session after session after session that's just emotionally draining, and we'll tag out. We'll swap out because we know that person's getting to a point where they can't handle another one. And so I'll jump in, or the manager will jump in, or another crisis clinician will jump in. We'll call them help from our other building and say, hey, we've been swamped today. We've had 16 call-ins. We've been back to back to back to back. We just need 30 minutes to get ourselves together. To get back together as a group, we'll go whatever we need to do, just individually as a group, rally ourselves back together and get back to it. It's very important. So strength space, find those positives. It can be hard, but most of the time you're going to be able to find something that you can look at that's a positive. This question is, we've been talking about our suicide with our boys since they were in elementary school, as sadly they experienced the loss of one of their classmates. I do want to pause here. This is more of a statement, but I do want to pause here because, again, since elementary school, as they lost one of their classmates to suicide. Talk about it early. Please talk about it often. It happens. Not often, but it happens. And you want to have that conversation. My boys are both in middle school now. And we want to make sure they keep the conversations going with them as they experience more anxiety, perfection with themselves in their grades and sports, and sometimes bullying as they've gotten older. We just want to make sure we are as aware as we can be with our boys and also helping our parents and kids to recognize the signs. First off, thank you for being aware of it. Kudos to the person who wrote this question in, the family who wrote this question in. Sounds like you're doing an excellent job. What I will say is it sounds like your child has some anxiety. It's a discussion for another day. And We don't necessarily know if that's tied into what they experienced, other things. I don't know that. You will know much better than I will. But again, kudos. I think this is great. It sounds like I said, there's some anxiety going on that may or may not be associated with experience. We don't want to assume it is. We can ask if it is, and that's fine. You may know that. It wasn't said in the question, but that's perfectly fine. We don't have to share the intimate details tonight. If my child's having suicidal thoughts, they aren't going to want to reach out to me or anyone for help, because obviously I would want to stop her from taking action. I don't know how to get her to reach out for help when she doesn't want to be helped. This is tricky. If your child is at this point where they don't want to reach out for help, go back to that number one warning sign for suicidal behaviors of hopelessness. You need to seek professional help in this situation. If your child isn't talking to you about it, but has endorsed suicidal ideation, you need to call for assistance. Not that we are magicians, not that we are wizards, but we have access to resources that you may not readily have access to. We're an outside source that maybe your child will talk to for some unknown reason. It's not because you're not doing a good job as a parent. It's because sometimes it's easier to talk to someone who's not your parent because you're worried about being judged, and then let us, your therapist or whoever it is, jump in and pull the parent back in. We do this a lot in our crisis program. Kids come in, I don't want mom to hear when I talk about this. I don't want dad to hear when I talk about this. Normally, it's because they feel guilty and they don't want mom and dad to be sad about their thoughts of killing themselves. Sometimes it's because they think they might get in trouble with their parents. What we do is we're going to have a conversation with the child. We're going to pull the parents back in, and we're going to be very open, and we're going to be very direct, especially in our crisis center. If you call our crisis center, our clinicians are trained to be very direct and very open about things and very solution focused, because again, a lot of times we don't know you. We don't have a long-term relationship with you. So we have to be direct. We have to know what's going on to serve you the best we can. So if your child's getting that situation, having suicidal thoughts, refusing to reach out to anyone, not wanting help, you need to seek more professional help. And unfortunately, this could mean something like an inpatient hospitalization. And I don't mean to scare anybody by that. We divert as many kids as we can from places like that. We have a crisis resolution program, which is nowhere near what an inpatient hospitalization program is like. It's not a lockdown facility. Kids get to wear their own clothes, etc. But we work intensely with them for up to 72 hours to help them develop coping skills, to get the parents involved and help them work with the child on our suggestions that we have. If there's a treatment team, we're going to pull them all together. We're going to get a discharge summary. We're going to get you all the information we can to help your child be as successful as possible. But again, if you're in that situation, you need to find some more support. If she doesn't want to be helped, call anyway. We will give you suggestions on how to handle the situation depending on what it is. It may be calling hospitals directly. It may be calling police to help transport to us. There's a lot of options in the situation. These are scary situations. This is when I would be very concerned as a parent if my child's not talking to me about it, especially if it's something you're really trying to talk about and you're trying to make a common conversation. These are big warning signs for someone who may have already had plans to do this. Any questions about that one? That's kind of a deep one. I just want to make sure we're doing okay. Also, I do want to note some of the stuff we're talking about today is very difficult. It's a difficult conversation. If you have questions, need to chat afterward, feel free. Send a private message to me or Pam, and we can chat briefly afterward if we need to, or direct you somewhere else where you can get some assistance who specializes in adults. Some of this is difficult, and we don't want to trigger anybody necessarily. Next question. My kid's 8 years old. We've never talked about the fact that anyone's own life even exists. How young to start talking about suicide? You know my answer on this, right? Talk about it. You don't want to just go up to your child and say, hey, let's talk about suicide. That's an awkward conversation. But your kids are seeing it on the news. Your kids are seeing it when it happens to celebrities. Use that as your foot in the door. You see it happen in our community, unfortunately. But use that as your foot in the door to say, hey, let's talk about this. This is a really difficult thing, but I want you to know we're here for you. We're here to support you. And if you ever feel this way, we want to have a conversation. And I think that's the best opportunity to bring that up. That's when I started talking to my children about it. The opportunity came up. I don't want this to sound like it's an opportunity, like it's a positive thing by any means, but it gets publicized and you see something about a celebrity ending their life from suicide. It's a good conversation to have because your kid may have questions about it. And if it's someone very famous, they're going to hear about it at school and they're going to be getting the information from possibly teachers, possibly students, most likely students. We want you guys giving what your values and your beliefs in this are, rather than the school, rather than the students. There's no offense to the school. This is absolutely no offense to teachers having that conversation. I encourage teachers to have open conversations about this as well, but that coming from a parent, it just means entirely different. So that's kind of your foot in the door. Not that you have to wait for that type of situation, but that's a good time to have that type of conversation. You could talk about maybe someone you heard about on attempting suicide. You see that kind of stuff on the news all the time. It's a good icebreaker. Again, next question is best ways to discuss the topic with your child. Again, I think we just answered that question, so we'll move on. What can we do if we suspect our child is suicidal? What signs do we look for? Again, hopelessness is going to be the number one sign you look for. Again, talk about it. Be very direct. If you come in to see a crisis clinician, or really any of our clinicians, if you already have a therapist, we're going to talk about this very directly, and it's uncomfortable. I'm going to be honest, because I'm going to talk to you about, hey, so you're thinking about killing yourself. I'm not going to say harming yourself. I'm not going to say, I'm going to be very direct and use words like killing yourself. Because a lot of times what that does is a child will come back, no, I'm just thinking about cutting on my arm. Oh, okay, well, let's talk about that. Have you had thoughts about killing yourself? No, just self-harm. Okay, so we'll talk about the difference between killing himself and self-harm and where they're at on the scales. We'll use scales again, 1 to 10. It's a great way to judge where someone is. What signs do you look for? We've talked about that a lot. Hopelessness, giving possessions away, abrupt changes in mood, isolation, and lack of interest in things they used to be interested in. A lot of those types of things are warning signs. And again, kind of that tricky warning sign is someone who's been depressed for a long time and abruptly is feeling better. It can be a sign that they've moved on to accepting the idea of killing themselves. Again, the next question, another question about when do we start? What's the appropriate age? Is there too young of an age? Yeah, I'm not going to have that conversation with my 4-year-old, but it depends on the kid. You may have an incredibly mature 5 or 6-year-old who has very adult conversations. It's okay, right? You may have a very immature 8 or 9-year-old who isn't ready to have that conversation. That's okay too. Next question is, I don't know how to make my child believe in herself as much as I believe in her. I don't know how to make her believe I love her as much as I do. She's often suicidal. I don't know how to motivate her to even leave the house anymore. She's overweight and it scares me to death that I might lose her. Once her meds were changed, she gained weight so fast. I believe her meds have a lot to do with it. I just want better for herself. First off, if you're concerned about the meds, contact your med provider. That's the best thing to do. Without me being a med provider, knowing what meds there are, I'm not even going to step on that landmine for myself as a therapist. Talk to your med provider about your concerns in that area for sure. If you think it's increasing suicidal thoughts, suicidal ideation, you can call in the Family Service and Guidance Center, ask for a nursing line, and they will get you in touch with a professional who can help you with that. That's a tricky one. We don't want to, I'm not going to answer that question because it's not my area of expertise. As far as how do you make your child believe in her, go back to what I said earlier. What is your child good at? What does your child excel in? What does your child like to do? What brings your child joy? What's your child's passion? Is it riding a bicycle? Is it playing a video game? Well, we may not like that as a parent. That might be what our child's hanging on to. Is it reading a book? Let's sit down, let's read a book together, right? Let's read I'm reading a scary book for Halloween with my 11-year-old daughter this year. She's so excited about it because she's reading a scary book. It's a Goosebumps book. It's not terribly scary, but for an 11-year-old who hasn't read those kind of books, she's super excited, right? We're going to read several of them, and she is stoked about it. I'm kind of stoked about it because I remember reading Goosebumps books when I was a kid. So I'm pretty excited. But again, it's a time for me to sit down and have a conversation with my kid about the book and just have a conversation with my child. It's an icebreaker. I do it for educational purposes, but I do it for icebreakers too. My wife was doing books with her. We do all this kinds of stuff because it opens up general conversation with our children. We don't necessarily have to jump straight into this conversation again. We can have an icebreaker, and it's really important to have. You can talk about a book and be like, you know what? Did you hear about in that book that kid said something about wanting to harm themselves because they were so scared? Have you ever felt that way? Right? We can use so much stuff, movies, books, to be that icebreaker for you. It's powerful. It is a very powerful tool. We have certain books and movies we use here in our crisis program for things like that. They're not your typical very therapy deep books and tools that we think, like Inside Out. Wonderful movie to sit down and have a conversation about it. Most of our clinicians here in our crisis program have puppets of the Inside Out ones. And I have seen 16 and 17-year-old boys and girls using those puppets in my office. I have no shame with it. I'm going to be goofy and have a good time with them. Another thing you can do when your child is feeling like that is use humor. Find something like it to distract them, get them engaged in something they want to do. And again, if they are so far down that path to where they don't want to engage and they can't even do those things they used to like to do, ask for professional assistance. We will jump in. Don't feel like you're failing as a parent, because it's harder to talk to your parent about these things. My parents did a great job of being open and talking about these things to me, but I sure didn't talk to my parents about girl issues. I sure didn't talk to my parents about what was going on in my relationships. I didn't want them to know, right? There are certain things that's easier to talk about to someone that's not your parent. What we do as therapists is we do a really good job of getting the kid to loosen up about that, and then to pull mom and dad in and say, hey, really think you should talk to mom and dad about this. And the vast majority of the time, we can get them to open up to you guys. Again, it's not that we're magic. It's not that you're failing. It's that a third party is a really big deal. Certain places in our country, you go to the East Coast, therapy's hot. It's hip. It's the cool thing to do for this reason exactly. Other places, you come to the Midwest, sometimes it may not be popular because it's seen as a bad thing or something wrong with you. A lot of clinicians go to therapy. Not because they're suffering from mental illness, not because they're suffering from depression, anxiety, whatever it is, because it's just nice to have someone to talk to and have a conversation with sometimes. A professional who can relay back information to you like you do to people all day long. Last question we have that's written out is, what age do you recommend starting this discussion? I told you this question was going to be asked a lot. My family has a long line of mental illness. I personally am also breaking a trauma and abuse cycle, but I know my daughter is going to feel the effects of it, so I worry about her. Couple things, right? Don't make the assumption that your daughter is going to feel the effects of it. That's kind of the same thing as an I understand kind of statement, right? Don't jump to that conclusion. If she's already suffering from it, I completely understand. I may be misunderstanding some of the context of this. Just know that this is just written text. It's very easily to misinterpret. So I'm just doing the best I can with what I've got to work with. But your family has a long line of mental illness doesn't necessarily mean your child's going to be mentally ill. Okay. Does it mean the chances are higher? Potentially, yeah, probably. Does it mean your child's going to be mentally ill? No. We can build resiliency in your child early. Address it early, address it often. This isn't just with suicide, this is with everything. We want parents teaching children about life, not their peers. Because if peers are teaching your children about life, things are going to look a lot different than if you are teaching your children about life. When you talk to your children openly about suicide or sex or depression or anxiety, they will come to you about these issues if you do it early and you do it often. If your child's already 14, 15, 16 years old, find your foot in the door. Find that book, find that movie that you accidentally watched together and say, hey, man, have you ever felt that way? That's a tough conversation to have with your child. Your 14, 15, 16-year-old may shut you out. Mom, I don't want to have this conversation. Probably a sign that they're not dealing with it right now, but it's okay to also say, hey, but if you ever want to have that conversation, I'm here for you. Let them know that the door is open. And never shut that door. Always leave that door open for your child, for your loved ones, for whoever it may be. That's all the written questions we have. Do you all have any follow-up questions for me? Feel free to put them in the chat or unmute. I'm more than willing to. I think we got about 10 minutes left, so. Don't everybody chime in at once.
I do not see any questions yet in the chat.
I do have a question. I'm going to turn my
Yes.
video on. Hi, my name's Christine. Hey, so I have a question like, what would be the best way as a role model for a young individual who may have suicidal discussions, thoughts, things like that? What is the best approach to help get the parent involved or seeing how serious this is as
Yeah.
the role model, as someone who doesn't spend a majority of time with the child?
Yep. So this is my role, right? This is what I do as a therapist is I'm
Yes.
going to pull the child aside, and my job is to try and convince that child to have the conversation with the parent, to pull the parent in and talk about how important it is and how we can improve that relationship. That's a great question, Christine. It's something we talk about with our clinicians here all the time is how do we repair that relationship that may already be damaged for whatever reason? How do we get the child to trust to have this conversation with their child? What I'm going to ask the child is, what is the barrier to talking to mom about this? What is your barrier to talking to dad about this, or grandma or grandpa, whoever it is in their life as their guardian? What are you worried about happening if you talk to them about that? That question alone is going to give you a lot of ammo to answer and come up with 5 or 6 more questions off of that too. When we're dealing with suicide and you're dealing with someone who is actually suicidal, we sit back and listen, but we're also going to ask a litany of questions, more than your typical therapy session. We're asking means, we're asking how they can do it, do they have access to it, those kinds of things. But if you have someone that you're working with, let's say you're a school teacher or you're another counselor, you want to be very direct about this. You want to talk to the child and figure out what the barriers in talking to the parents are, because you might find something out that there really is a barrier to talking to their parents as a school teacher or a counselor or whatever it is. And that changes things drastically, right? Well, maybe it's not a safe environment. Maybe something's going on that we really need to talk to the parents about. Hey, I think your child is suicidal, right? We have an obligation to talk to parents about that. In my opinion, if I have a child coming to me that's saying they're suicidal, but saying, don't tell my parents, it's not going to happen. I'm going to have a conversation with the parents, regardless of that relationship. If the parents are pushing me away and not willing to have a conversation, and I think it's serious enough, there's other entities that get involved. I don't want to do that. I don't want to have that conversation. I don't want to call child services and say, hey, we really need to have this conversation because I'm concerned about this. But what I do in that situation, which 99% of the time revolves it, is I go to the family in a very caring way, in a very strengths-based way. And I'm just going to use Pam because I see her. Say, hey, Pam, your daughter has expressed being suicidal to me, and saying you're not willing to talk about it, you're not taking it seriously, and I'm very concerned about your child's level of suicidal ideation. You're not wanting to take them to a hospital, you're not wanting to get into therapy, whatever the case may be. I'm concerned enough that I feel like I have to call DCF. Now, if you're willing to work with me today, and we can have this conversation and get the help we need now, we can avoid that. I'm not trying to threaten a parent. I'm trying to be open and honest and help the child from doing something that they can't take back. That's a really difficult thing to do. I hope that answers your question, Christine. Again, it's exploring. You got to explore. If you don't know the family well, find someone who does.
Thank you.
That was an excellent, excellent question.
Yeah. We spend a lot of time in our training manual for clinicians on that in crisis. It's something we talk about a lot. And it's one of those things you can't prepare for. It's one of those things you have to learn by doing a lot of times, because every situation is vastly, vastly different. Any other questions? Or answers for that matter? We like answers too.
Travis, can you, and I'm going to obviously continue to monitor the chat. Can
Sure.
you explain what services, what crisis services FSGC provides, and best ways to reach out for help, and specifically for people who are in Topeka, in Shawnee County?
Our staff are available 24/7 for you. If you call during the day, excuse me, you're going to get Family Service and Guidance Center employees directly Monday through Friday, 8 to 5. After 5 o'clock, you'll get routed to our call service. Health Source Integrated Solutions helps us with that. The reason we ask them to help with us instead of taking it directly is because our clinicians who work all day 8 to 5 are also the clinicians who work 5 to 8 a.m. And so it's a very difficult job to do, and we have to take care of our clinicians as well. So what HIS will do is they'll route those calls to us if they can't handle them on their own. They'll send those calls to us. One of our on-call clinicians will get the call. They'll reach out to you. Usually our response time is usually within 10 minutes. We're going to be back with you very quickly unless we are just absolutely swamped. If we are, call back in. HIS, I guarantee you, will harass us enough that someone's calling. If the clinician doesn't call, I'm the backup person. They will always call my cell phone. I have my cell phone with me all the time because I'm passionate about what I do and I want to be there for my staff and I want to be there for the kids we serve. If they can't get a hold of me for some reason, they call the manager, they call our clinical director, they have a list to go down. So there's always somebody, but keep in mind those folks are mental health professionals as well. They have clinicians there, they have therapists there, they have case management level staff there. They're going to be able to help you too. But our number 232-5005 is the best number to get in touch with us quickly and directly. It's a great resource. Pam, we have the 7 Cups number and then a text line on our website. We had a young man using that just last night, talking about how helpful it was. I wanted to share that with you, Pam, so you knew that was still something that we're using and seeing kids use in our crisis program. As for crisis services we have, I know we kind of had a discussion about this today in our crisis team, and the team was harassing me about the language of something, and they know I don't like to get hung up on words. I just want to get in and get it done and knock it out. And they were like, well, can we call it crisis? Can we call it urgent? Can we call it emergent? And I was like, oh my gosh, I'm going to go bald faster than I anticipated. So they were having a very good time joking with me and sending me emails and calling me and just harassing me about it today in their in-between clients. But crisis services are what they sound. If you're in a crisis, you define the crisis. We're not going to define that for you. If you're in a crisis for one family, maybe a kid screaming and yelling. A crisis for another family, maybe a kid running out a window of the street and threatening to kill themselves. Mm-hmm. You're going to see different levels of crisis for different levels of families, for your tolerance level as well. But yeah, call us 232-5005. Our crisis center is open. We have a crisis stabilization unit. It's not an acute hospital. It's not a lockdown facility. We do take kids in. We have kids come in a couple different capacities. They can come in for scheduled respite care if they have waiver services, etc. I don't want to go too far down that rabbit hole because that's an hour-long discussion in itself.
Yeah, it is.
But if they are a current client, we can get them into our crisis program right away. If they aren't a current client, what we'll do is we're going to try and make you a current client as soon as possible if you're interested. And we may not be able to get it done that night, depending on what is going on that night. And if we are concerned enough, we'll look at hospitals such as Stormontville Behavioral Health, Camber Mental Health in Kansas City, Marillac in Kansas City, if we're that concerned about your child's mental health. We try and divert everybody that we can, because we don't want kids going to mental health hospitals. We want families handling these situations. So we want to equip you guys with as many tools as we possibly can to be successful. That is how our crisis clinicians are trained. And that is how we monitor everything we do. We have our rate of diverting kids is very high. We divert about 75% of the kids that come to us to either our program and away or just back home. That's really high compared to other state entities. Not saying we're better than everybody else, even though we are. Just saying, no, we take a lot of pride in it and we focus a lot on it. And it's really important to our program. It's really important to our agency. We partner with other mental health centers as well. And we are always working on how we can improve better as an entire system of mental health centers and mental health providers. But again, 72-hour stays is typically what we do. A kid will be with for 72 hours. They'll have group therapy, they'll have individual therapy, and they'll have a staff member with them one-on-one for the entirety of their stay. It's a great program. Kids learn a lot from each other. If a parent wants to come tour the facility and they have a child who you think might benefit from it, reach out to us, call in and to our main line and just ask for crisis and say what you're needing. We'll set up a time where you can come and do that with me or with one of the supervisors or with the manager, Ramon. We'll help you do that. It's tricky to do because we have to worry about HIPAA and we have to worry about that. We kind of have to coordinate things. So just know that we want to be able to help you and give you guys as much information about what our facility is like and what we do.
Yeah. And I want to re-emphasize, if a child or teen is in crisis, you do not have to be a current client to reach out for help, to call the number. Because we are the community safety net when it comes to adolescent children's mental health. So don't ever hesitate. Don't ever hesitate. Just a quick reminder, if you need a certificate, I know we're running out of time. Need a certificate, please just type in your name, first and last name in the chat box. We'll be sure to get that. And again, thank you so much for your time. If you have friends, colleagues, please share some of this information that you learned tonight. And we always do put the recordings up on the FSGCtopeka.com website, so you can always go back or let your friends and colleagues know that, hey, there's this resource, there's this information available. So, and also lastly, be sure to follow our Facebook page, because we are posting a lot more information there, tips, signs to look for on a variety of different mental health topics. So thank you again. And Travis, thank you so much for taking your time to share your experience and knowledge with us this evening.
Always, Pam. You know, I enjoy doing it. It's passion. I love it.
Great job.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for attending, everybody. Have a great night.
Take care. Bye-bye.